So, as I previously stated, pastoralists are not concerned with land, and therefore they have a hard time in the contemporary world because they will cross borders and boundaries without thinking twice, because to them, their animals are what they own, and their animals are what they're concerned with. In terms of sustainability, pastoralists live in various environments, and it kind of depends on the animal how sustainable their area is. Most pastoralists are now forced to work in areas of the world that are not necessarily the greatest for water. And since water is the basic necessity of most animal life, they are at a little bit of risk for survival. Again, we will be studying a couple different examples of pastoralists throughout the semester, and we might watch a video in the coming weeks about that. So moving into agriculture, as I said earlier in the first part of this lecture, people first settled and started planting crops about 12,000 years ago. This map shows you about where that had started to happen. Most specifically, they were in an area called the Fertile Crescent, which is Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley on this map. Other regions also developed farming at about the same time, agriculture is now pretty common in most areas of the world. Early farmers, like in this fun picture of Egypt, did use basic materials and would probably have been considered horticulturalists. In the contemporary world, this map shows us where farming is still actively done. As you're probably familiar, we do quite a bit of farming here in the United States. And there's a lot of farming in Europe and South Asia. Unfortunately, the area where farming first developed isn't necessarily the greatest place to farm currently. As you can see in the Nile Valley there in Egypt, there is no farming happening in the contemporary world. And the area of Mesopotamia is mostly dried up. Farming and agriculture really entails the growing of crops on permanent plots, and agriculture uses heavy equipment. And things like irrigation and fertilizer and plows that go beyond just the ox pulling a metal plow and now moves into what we're used to as John Deere type equipment. Most agricultural groups produce more food than what is required for them, and therefore sell the products of farming to the wider market. We do have examples of smaller family farms, and these kinds of farms will only produce enough for themselves plus a little bit of surplus. And family farms are the ones that generally appear in our farmers markets. Where I live, we have one every Saturday. I'm sure there are several here in the North Adams region. Terracing is done for certain types of farming, and this is found most commonly in South Asia where they grow rice. Terracing is a really interesting type of farming as it requires a lot of water and a lot of complex ways of creating plots. Most terraces are plowed with more basic equipment than what farms in the United States would use. When we get to large-scale farming, this is where we have the concept of the wage worker. And large-scale agriculture is mostly for surplus, and almost no large-scale farms produce for their own consumption. So in the United States, we have a lot of subsidies for certain types of food like corn and soybeans. In other areas of the world, other governments will subsidize similar products. Wage workers introduce a new idea in the agricultural market, and this is the idea of a hierarchy where the people that own the farm are contracted by bigger companies. So companies like Tyson and Kraft and places like that will sort of fund big farms. And therefore you have to follow their rules when it comes to setting up and organizing. And then you hire workers who are, in the most cases in the United States, are undocumented workers who don't necessarily pay taxes and don't necessarily get a living wage. In Australia, large-scale farms have a different setup. They actually hire people your age, college students, who are taking a year off from school, and they will house them and pay them a living wage, feed them twice or three times a day, and then you get a stipend, so on the weekends and your days off you can travel around. A lot of youth in Australia travel this way, so they go and they work on a tomato farm for, a month or so, and they get housing, and then they can just travel and party and do whatever they want while they decide what's next for them. It's actually not a bad system, and a lot of European students actually go to Australia to do this, just to travel around the country. In this image we have a picture of a more industrialized version of farming, where we are trying to mass produce, in this case, eggs and chickens. And a lot of these kinds of industrial farms are controlled by the bigger market, and they have to produce a certain number of things by a certain amount of time and are really restricted by the market. These kinds of farms are a little more traumatic for the owners because they are under a lot of pressure by the bigger businesses that own them. In terms of farming, division of labor on small-scale farms, generally the men perform most of the sort of harder jobs out in the fields, and most times women are dealing with the marketing and the selling outside of the farm. So it's going to be usually the women who go to the farmers markets, and this is a more traditional family farm concept. Owning a farm is a substantial investment, and so you own your land and you're invested in that land, and it's catastrophic when things go wrong. Agriculture is a very large investment, but it's also pretty sustainable if you have the resources, the time, and the energy to put into maintaining it. Because of this, there is a lot of sort of social segregation and ecological problems that can happen due to farming. And therefore, things like water pollution and problems with fertilizers do come up in large-scale farming. Some of the biggest areas of family farms is actually here in the United States. And while we do have a lot of corporations that run farms, most of them are owned by families and then are sort of subsidized by bigger corporations. Okay, moving into our last set here. Our last mode of living is industrialism, and this is the one that you'll be most familiar with. Most states, in terms of the band, tribe, chiefdom, and state, are industrial. Industrialism means that goods and services are produced through mass production and mass employment. There's really no clear division of labor, and sustainability really is dependent upon the economy. This is a pretty standard idea of what we think the Industrial Revolution brought. People sitting in big rooms processing small tiny things. And this is true. We no longer here in the United States have a lot of these factories. Most of these have been outsourced to other places. So you're not going to find a lot of this in contemporary America. Something that came with industrialism is the sort of standardization of education. Once adults had to go and work in factories for 8 to 10 hours a day, their children had to go somewhere. And rather than the idea that children were working full-time in factories as well, it's actually more true that they were in schools. So the one-room schoolhouses in the countrysides became common, and public education systems were developed in England very quickly after the start of industrialism. There were children working in factories, but at the same time, we have just as much evidence that children were being educated. Something else that came with industrialization is this idea of two sectors. We have the formalized sector, and this is where there's wage or salary work and everyone gets taxed. And this is where sort of the traditional idea of people working in factories came about. But we also have the informal sector that develops right alongside this in industrialization. And this is where there's less officially registered work. And in fact, you might participate in the informal sector because you might babysit or work on a farm and not pay taxes on those wages. It also includes prostitution and gambling and small-scale vending. Not all people that sell hot dogs on the side of the road make enough money to have to pay taxes. Because of these two different levels, we also get a separation of classes and inequalities because of this. The picture on the bottom of the screen here shows the sort of various wages people can earn according to the formal sector, and this includes, minimum wage all the way through the CEO, who makes way more money than most of us do. Also, through industrialism, we get big box stores like Walmart and Kmart appearing, and these often outsell smaller scale stores that we're used to seeing on main streets in America. And industry has really created rising inequalities where we have social stratification, where there's a difference in people based on gender, assumed race, and wealth because of industry. There's also increase in student debt, which you are now familiar with, and formalized social classes. So we have sort of the elite members of society, the white-collar workers, which would be managers, and the blue-collar workers, which would be sort of the construction worker, etc. Industry is really sort of the thing that started social inequalities becoming more and more advanced, which is quite unfortunate, but mostly true. In a few weeks, we will be watching a video on what industrialization has done to the farming industries in other countries. Okay, that's it for now. Make sure you check the assignment section of Canvas for your assignment for this week as well.